The wind cut through the midnight silence of the financial district, a sterile canyon of glass and steel where the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment the sun retreated. Junho sat in the back of the armored sedan, his reflection ghosting against the window, a man who had spent the last 5 years building an empire on discipline and terrifying precision. He was the architect of the city's shadow economy, a man who moved millions with a quiet nod, yet tonight, the silence of the car felt suffocating. The convoy slowed as it navigated the turn near the public park, a patch of green that had turned gray under the sodium streetlights, a place where the city's forgotten drifted when the shelters reached capacity. Junho usually never looked. To look was to acknowledge a chaos he couldn't control, and he was a man who required absolute order. But something caught his eye, a flash of familiar blue denim against the brutalist concrete of a park bench. It was a texture that didn't belong in this district, a rigid, faded fabric that spoke of survival rather than leisure. He signaled the driver to stop, a sharp gesture that brought the heavy vehicle to a halt instantly. His security detail stiffened, hands moving to earpieces, but Junho was already opening the door, stepping out into the biting air. He walked toward the bench, the sound of his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement, a rhythm of authority disrupting the quiet. The figure on the bench was curled tight, knees pulled to chest, trying to preserve heat. She was wearing a denim jacket that looked 2 sizes too big and a thin gray shirt that offered no protection against the frost settling on the metal slats. Her face was turned away, buried in the crook of her arm, but the curve of her neck, the way her hair fell in a chaotic cascade of dark curls, sent a jolt of recognition through him that felt like a physical blow.
Juno froze.
His breath hitched in his throat, condensing in the cold air. He took another step, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence he hadn't felt since his early days in the subterranean fighting pits of Seoul. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched the shoulder of the denim jacket. The woman flinched violently, gasping as she scrambled upright, clutching an old, tattered manila envelope to her chest as if it contained diamonds. The streetlight caught her face, illuminating the sharp cheekbones, the exhausted shadows beneath her eyes, and the unmistakable beauty that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. It was Camille, his Camille, the woman he had let go because he thought his world was too dangerous for her light. He stared at her, his mind unable to reconcile the vibrant, brilliant woman he had known with this shivering, terrified figure sleeping on a park bench. The shock paralyzed him for a second longer before rage, hot and searing, flooded his veins, not at her, but at the universe that had allowed this to happen. "Camille," he whispered, his voice cracking, stripping away the veneer of the untouchable boss. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the glare of the headlights behind him, and for a moment, he saw the flicker of recognition, followed immediately by a wall of shame. She pulled the denim jacket tighter, trying to shrink into herself, to disappear into the wood of the bench. "Junho," she breathed, the name sounding foreign on her dry lips. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, her knuckles white. He followed her gaze. The envelope was thick, worn at the edges, covered in scribbled calculations and dates. It wasn't drugs. It wasn't a bottle. It was paperwork. He knew the look of bureaucracy. He knew the weight of paper that carried life sentences in fine print. She wasn't an addict. She was a casualty. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the dirt, ignoring his men watching from the car, and placed his hands over hers. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and urgent. "Why are you here?" You were supposed to be in Chicago. You were supposed to be running that gallery." Camille pulled her hands back, the friction of her rough skin against his smooth palms serving as a jarring reminder of the distance between them now. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the pavement where the frost was beginning to sparkle. "There is no gallery, Junho," she said, her voice steady but threaded with a deep, resonating exhaustion that terrified him more than her tears would have. "There's nothing. Just debt. Just lists of people I can't pay and places I can't stay." She clutched the envelope tighter. "Please, go back to your car. You look expensive. You don't belong here." The irony hit him like a physical strike. He was the one who controlled the streets, yet seeing her here, He felt like an intruder in a world of suffering he had chosen to ignore. He reached for the envelope, gently, but with a command that wouldn't be refused. She resisted for a second, then let go, her strength failing. He opened the flap. Inside, there wasn't a stash of illicit cash. There was a stack of rejection letters, eviction notices, and a small, clear plastic bag containing bills and coins. He counted it instantly with a glance. $42. That was it. That was the sum total of her existence. And beneath the money was a letter from a legal firm, a firm he recognized. A firm that handled cleanup for corporate developers in his sector. "You didn't leave because you stopped loving me," he said, the realization dawning on him with the weight of a collapsing building. He stood up, extending a hand to her. She looked at it, then at him, her pride warring with her survival instinct. "I left because I refused to be bought," she corrected, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce spark that reminded him of the woman who had once challenged him at a charity gala, the woman who had captivated him instantly. "And when you refuse to be bought by the wrong people, Junho, they make sure you can't sell your skills to anyone else." She tried to stand on her own, using the back of the bench for support, but her legs buckled. Junho moved faster than thought, catching her before she hit the ground. He swept her up into his arms, the lightness of her frame sickening him. She had lost weight, too much weight. "Put me down," she murmured, but the fight was draining out of her. "I can't go with you. I can't be part of your debt ledger." "You aren't a debt," he said, his jaw set so tight his teeth ached. He carried her toward the car, the security detail scrambling to open the door. The warmth of the vehicle rushed out to meet them, a stark contrast to the freezing reality she had been living in. He placed her gently on the leather seat, the scent of expensive cedar and conditioned air enveloping her. She looked around the interior, her eyes wide, contrasting the luxury with her dusty denim jacket. He climbed in beside her and signaled the driver to move. "Take us to the penthouse," he ordered, his voice devoid of emotion, masking the turbulence inside. "And call Dr. Park. Tell him to meet us there." Now, Camille leaned her head back against the seat, clutching the envelope again. "It wasn't an accident," she whispered, eyes closing. "They took everything, Junho. They didn't just fire me. They erased me." The drive to the penthouse was a blur of city lights streaking past the tinted windows, a visual metaphor for how fast life could move when you had power and how static it became when you had none. Junho watched her sleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. He picked up the envelope she had finally released in her exhaustion. He turned on the reading light, the beam cutting through the gloom of the cabin. He began to read, really read, the documents she had been guarding. The first was a termination letter from a logistics company, a subsidiary of a conglomerate he did business with. The reason cited was gross misconduct, a generic label that acted as a death sentence for a career. But attached to it was a handwritten note, a photocopy of a ledger she must have stolen or preserved. It showed discrepancies in housing allocations, safety violations that had been signed off as compliant. She had tried to report it. She had tried to blow the whistle. And in response, the system had crushed her. He flipped to the next page. A credit report. Systematically destroyed. Identity theft charges that looked fabricated, legal fees that had drained her savings, a lawsuit for defamation that had been settled out of court for everything she owned. The name of the plaintiff on the lawsuit made Junho's blood run cold. Quan Investments. It was a shell company. One of his shell companies. The realization hit him with the force of a bullet. The machinery he had built to launder money and secure real estate, the machinery he thought he kept separate from the innocent civilians of the city, had been weaponized against the woman he loved. Someone inside his organization, someone with access to the levers of his power, had done this. She hadn't just fallen through the cracks of society. She had been pushed by his own hand, or at least, a hand he controlled. He looked at her sleeping form, the denim jacket stained with the grime of the city he claimed to rule, and felt a wave of nausea. He had built a kingdom to protect himself, and that very kingdom had devoured her. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, a sprawling expanse of marble and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the skyline. It was silent, pristine, and suddenly felt like a mausoleum. He carried her to the guest suite, the one with the softest sheets, the room that caught the morning sun. He laid her down, removing her shoes, worn sneakers with holes in the soles, and covering her with a duvet that cost more than she had earned in the last year. Dr. Park arrived minutes later, a discreet man who asked no questions. As the doctor examined her, Junho retreated to his office, the glass-walled command center where he made life-and-death decisions. He threw the envelope onto his mahogany desk. The contents spilled out. The timeline was clear. She had been fired 3 months after they broke up. The eviction was 2 months later. The denial of unemployment benefits, the blocked bank accounts, it was a surgical dismantling of a human life. He poured himself a drink but didn't drink it. He stared at the amber liquid, seeing the reflection of a monster. He had thought leaving her was the noble choice, that his absence would keep her safe from his enemies. Instead, his absence had left her vulnerable to his own system. The door to the office creaked open. It wasn't the doctor. It was Camille. She was wrapped in a silk robe he had left for her, looking small but standing upright, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "You know who they are," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I saw the logo on your laptop screen when we walked in. The crest. It's the same one on the eviction notice." Her voice was trembling, not with fear, but with a righteous, burning anger. "Did you do it? Did you hate me that much?" "No," Junho said, the word escaping him like a plea. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her, terrified to bridge the gap. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Camille, I didn't know." He gestured to the papers. This is a rot, a disease in my house. "I thought I was protecting you by staying away," she laughed, a dry, humorless sound that cut him deeper than a knife. "Protecting me?" She stepped into the room, her eyes locking onto his. "You built a world where money is the only god, Junho. You empowered men who treat people like line items. You don't get to be shocked when that machine starts eating people you care about. You don't get to play the savior now just because you found me on a bench. I am not a stray cat. I am a consequence. I am what happens when men like you look away." Junho stood in the silence of her verdict. She was right. He had delegated the cruelty, outsourced the brutality of his business to lieutenants and lawyers, washing his hands of the specific sufferings while reaping the general profits. "I will fix it," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, the tone of a man declaring war. "I will burn it down if I have to. I will find the name on this paper, and I will make them pay for every second you shivered on that bench." He reached for his phone, ready to rain hellfire on his subordinates. "Stop," Camille commanded, her voice surprisingly strong. She walked over and placed her hand over the phone, preventing him from making the call. "If you just kill someone or fire someone or throw money at me, you haven't fixed anything. You've just balanced a ledger." She looked down at the papers on the desk, then back up at him, her dark eyes demanding something harder than violence. "There are others. The building they evicted me from, it wasn't just me. It was 20 families. The safety report I refused to sign? That warehouse collapsed last week. 3 workers are in the ICU. If you want redemption, Junho, you don't get to just save the ex-wife you still find attractive. You have to save them all. You have to use this," she gestured to the opulent room, "to undo what you did." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a demand for a transformation he wasn't sure he was capable of. He was a mafia boss, not a saint. But looking at her, seeing the steel in her spine that the streets hadn't been able to break, he knew he had no choice. The romance wasn't in the rescue. It was in the reckoning. He slowly pulled his hand away from the phone and looked at her. "Tell me everything," he said, pulling a chair out for her. "Start from the beginning. Names, dates, locations." The sunrise broke over the city not as a symbol of hope, but as a harsh interrogation light, exposing the sprawling maps and documents that now covered every inch of the mahogany desk in the penthouse. They had been working for 6 hours straight, a feverish excavation of the truth that had buried Camille. The room smelled of stale coffee and the ozone scent of overheating printers. Junho watched Camille from across the desk. She had finally stopped shivering, wrapped in a cashmere blanket he had draped over her shoulders, but her focus was razor-sharp. She was highlighting names on a spreadsheet, the roster of the evicted, the injured, the silenced. It was in this quiet chaos that the distance between them began to close, not with grand gestures, but with the soft, terrifying intimacy of shared burden. He saw her rub her eyes, the fatigue etching deep lines into her face, and without a word, he moved to the small kitchenette, preparing a cup of tea exactly the way she used to take it, plenty of honey, a dash of cinnamon. When he placed the mug near her hand, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was electric, a sudden grounding wire in the storm. She looked up, her guard lowering for just a fraction of a second. "You remembered," she said softly, her voice raspy from reading legal codes aloud. "I remember everything," Jun-ho replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. Instead, he let his thumb graze the rough skin of her knuckles, a tactile reminder of the hardship she had endured while he sat in air-conditioned boardrooms. "I remember the way you pace when you're thinking. I remember that you hate the cold. And I remember that you never give up, even when you should." He walked around the desk, kneeling beside her chair so he wasn't looming over her. The power dynamic had to be dismantled here, in this room, before they could face the world. "Camille," he said, looking at the spreadsheet where she had circled the name Director Kong. "This man. He runs the logistics division. He's been with me for 10 years. He was at our wedding. The admission tasted like ash. He did this to you to cut costs by 4%. That was the price of your life." A margin error. Camille turned the mug in her hands, the warmth seeping into her palms. She looked at him, not with the anger of the night before, but with a sorrowful clarity. "He didn't do it because he hated me, Jun-ho. He did it because the system you built rewards efficiency over humanity. If we go into that room today, you can't just be the boss. You have to be the traitor to your own creation." She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his for a fleeting, desperate moment. "Are you ready to lose their loyalty to gain my forgiveness?" The boardroom of Quan Investments was a fortress of silence, soundproofed against the noise of the city below. 12 men in tailored suits sat around the long glass table, their posture rigid, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure as Jun-ho entered. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He stood by the door, holding it open.
Camille walked in.
The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the rustle of unease. She was no longer wearing the denim jacket. She was dressed in a sharp, slate-gray suit Jun-ho had delivered, but she wore no makeup to hide the exhaustion. She looked like a specter of accountability. Director Kong, a man with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, stood up, feigning polite confusion. "Sir, I wasn't aware we had external guests for the strategy meeting." Jun-ho's expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. "This isn't a strategy meeting, Kong. It's a performance review." He nodded to Camille. She stepped forward, placing the thick envelope of evidence in the center of the table. The sound of it hitting the glass echoed like a gunshot. 3 months ago, Camille began, her voice steady, projecting to the back of the room without shouting, "you authorized a structural bypass on the West District housing project. You cited expedited zoning as the reason." She opened the folder, sliding a photo across the table, an image of a cracked support beam she had taken on her phone days before her eviction. "This is what expedited zoning looks like. It looks like a ceiling collapsing on a child's bed." Kang's smile faltered. He looked at Jun-ho for support, for the unspoken code of brotherhood that usually protected them. "Sir, the woman is clearly emotional. These are standard industry variances. We saved the company $12 million this quarter." Jun-ho walked slowly toward Kong, his footsteps heavy. He stopped behind the director's chair, his hands resting on the leather backrest. 12 million. Jun-ho repeated, the number hanging in the air. He looked at Camille, seeing the unwavering strength in her eyes, a strength that money couldn't buy and poverty couldn't steal. "I found my wife sleeping on a bench in the cold because of your $12 million, the room gasped. He hadn't called her his ex-wife. "She isn't emotional, Kong. She is precise. And she is the new head of auditing. Explain the variances to her." He pulled the chair out, signaling for Kong to stand, effectively stripping him of his seat and his power. Camille didn't flinch. She locked eyes with the man who had ruined her life and didn't blink. Sit down, she told the room. We have a lot of work to do. The aftermath of the purge was a different kind of violence, the violence of upheaval. By evening, the office was in chaos. Security teams were escorting executives out of the building. Forensic accountants were seizing hard drives. The empire was eating itself to survive. In the eye of the hurricane, Junho found Camille on the balcony of the penthouse, staring out at the city grid. The wind was whipping her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. He approached her slowly, carrying 2 coats. He draped one over her shoulders, his hands lingering there, pulling the fabric tight to shield her. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving them both raw and exposed. They're going to come for you, she said, her voice lost to the wind. Shareholders, the other families. You broke the code. You chose a person over the profit. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his.
Why?
You could have just written me a check and sent me away. It would have been cleaner. Junho stepped closer, closing the gap until he could shield her from the wind with his own body. The city lights reflected in his dark eyes, but his focus was entirely on her. I spent 3 years thinking that power meant invulnerability, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. I thought if I was strong enough, nothing could touch me. But last night, when I saw you on that bench, I realized I had built a castle on a graveyard. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a touch of reverence, a silent apology for every day they had been apart. There is no clean way to leave the person who holds your soul, Camille. I am not choosing a person over profit. I am choosing my life over my death. Because a life without you, a life where I let you suffer, is just a slow death. Camille leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, a single tear escaping. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be held, not out of weakness, but out of a shared need for anchor. I'm scared, she whispered against his chest. I'm scared that we can't fix it. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. We don't have to fix it all tonight. We just have to promise not to look away. The next week was a blur of concrete action, a grueling marathon of restitution that tested their resolve. It wasn't enough to fire the corrupt. They had to rebuild what was broken. Junho drove Camille to the site of the tenement building in the West District, the place where the eviction notices had first been served. It was a gray, crumbling structure, the embodiment of neglect. But today, it was surrounded by scaffolding. Construction crews, paid for by the personal liquidation of Junho's luxury car collection, were already working. He walked a few paces behind her, letting her lead. This was her victory, not his. He watched as she spoke to the families who had gathered, women holding children, men with workmen's hands who looked at Junho with suspicion but at Camille with recognition. She was one of them. She had survived the cold with them. He stood by the perimeter, watching her point to the blueprints, explaining the new safety retrofits, the rent freezes, the ownership transfer clauses he had forced his lawyers to draft. A young girl, no older than 5, ran up to Camille and tugged on her pants leg. Camille knelt down, smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that Junho hadn't seen in years. It broke him and remade him all at once. He realized then that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a daily labor. He walked over, joining the circle. He didn't speak over her. He stood beside her, a silent sentinel. When she introduced him not as the boss, but as the partner who was going to make this right, the suspicion in the crowd didn't vanish, but it softened. He handed a pen to the community leader to sign the new deed. This isn't charity, Junho said, his voice firm, addressing the crowd but looking at Camille. This is a debt payment. We're just balancing the books. Camille looked at him, surprised by his use of her own logic, and a soft, proud smile touched her lips. She reached out and squeezed his hand, a public declaration of unity that meant more than any press release. That night, the penthouse felt different. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of a shared life beginning again. They sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded not by eviction notices, but by architectural plans for a community center. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, golden glow over the room. Camille had fallen asleep with her head on Junho's lap, her breathing deep and even, the sleep of the safe. He sat motionless, afraid to wake her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. He looked at the paperwork, the millions of dollars he had signed away, the enemies he had made, the dangerous path that lay ahead. And then he looked at her face, relaxed and peaceful. The trade was worth it. She stirred, blinking her eyes open, catching him watching her. "You're staring," she murmured sleepily, shifting to look up at him. "I'm memorizing," he corrected, brushing a curl away from her forehead. "I want to remember what it looks like when you're not afraid." She sat up slowly, turning to face him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I'm still a little afraid," she admitted, her hand finding his. "The world is still hard, Junho. And you. You still have a lot of shadows to outrun," he nodded, accepting the truth of it. "Then we run together," he said. "No more separate worlds. No more protecting you by leaving you." He leaned in, and this time, there was no hesitation. He kissed her, not with the hungry passion of their youth, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness, a kiss that tasted of second chances and ironclad promises. It was a seal on a new contract, one written not in